A common problem when cooking with offset smokers is that they tend to cook briskets a little bit unevenly. For example, the point could be way overcooked while your flat is way undercooked and tough. But is there a way to cook briskets more evenly simply by rotating them around during the cook? I'm going to test that theory by rotating a brisket constantly for an entire 8 to 12 hour cook, and I'll compare it to a brisket that I just let sit with its point towards the firebox for the entire time. But how do I rotate a brisket constantly for 8 to 12 hours? This seems like a job for Smoky Steve. Let's get spinning. Oh, I'm all dizzy now. I started with a worm drive motor and connected a rod to it that would spin constantly. It has a connector on it that I'm going to attach a grate to, more on that later. The RPMs on this motor are a little bit too fast, so I installed a speed limiter on it with an electrical cord that I could plug into a standard wall outlet. I tested it out and it spun about this quickly, which I could reduce with the speed limiter dial, so everything seemed to be working great. Speaking of grate, I needed one, so I stole this round grate from one of my smokers, and I cut some of the grates so a rod connector would fit snugly right in the center. Now I just have to weld it together, which is kind of problematic because I don't know how to weld. But luckily, I'm planning to build my own backyard smoker soon, so I've been getting all the welding equipment I need. The only thing left to do is really start welding, so this will be my very first weld. But before we get to that train wreck, I want to thank Gentle Bands for sponsoring this video. Gentle Bands makes men's rings cool again by master crafting rings from unconventional materials that are actually interesting to men, like whiskey barrels, antlers, meteorites, titanium from spaceships, and even frickin' dinosaur bones. Their rings are so manly that it makes my wedding ring look like it sits down to pee. So I decided to pick out a ring from Gentle Bands that was a little bit cooler than my boring old one. I ended up picking the Eternus, which is made of meteorite and opal, and it looks like it's from space. It arrived in nice packaging, and I could immediately tell it was handcrafted with a lot of attention to detail. Very cool. Valentine's Day is coming up soon, so put the bug in your wife's ear and ask for one of these rings, or just get another ring. You can get 25% off your ring with code SteveBBQ, and they're also offering free engraving services right now, which you should definitely take advantage of. So go check out Gentle Bands and get your new ring today, one that actually means something to you. Okay, back to welding. After a bit of trial and error, I was able to stick these two pieces of metal together with a admittedly really crappy weld, but it was in fact stuck together, so mission accomplished. Now I'm connecting the grate to the motor and rod assembly and testing it with some weight. Looks like it works, and I'm pretty sure it can hold a brisket, so it's time for a live test. I'm opening up my Oklahoma Joe's Highland and marking a point directly in the bottom center of the cook chamber, closer to the stack end. Then I'm drilling a hole just large enough for the rod to fit through. Then the motor and rod assembly goes up through the bottom of the smoker. I just screwed together some wood blocks to keep the motor in place, and I'm attaching the grill once it's installed. Spins like a dream. Now I'm getting the test briskets ready by laying down some pepper, then some table salt, and finally a layer of Franklin's barbecue spice rub. Those are going to sit and dry brine while I axe murder some wood Jack Nicholson style, and then I'm lighting my firebox with my grill gun. Now for the moment of truth, I'm placing the brisket on the round grate, turning the motor on at 10% speed, and to my surprise, it actually works perfectly. There's a problem though. I can't use wired probes to monitor the internal temperatures of the brisket throughout the cook because they'll get tangled as the thing spins around. But fortunately, I have a meter block with 4 wireless remote probes. So I'm installing the probes per the manufacturer's directions in the point, the left side, the flat, and the right side of the brisket. This way I'll be able to monitor how evenly the brisket is cooking without opening the smoker door at all for the entire cook. This brisket is now going to spin away at 225 to 250 degrees until it hits the stall. Then up to 275 to 300 degrees Fahrenheit until the internal temperature reaches at least 190 degrees Fahrenheit everywhere in the brisket. In this case, that took around 8 hours, and unsurprisingly, this brisket cooked pretty evenly. The only problematic thing was that the flat cooked faster than the rest of the brisket for the entire cook because it's obviously thinner. But in general, it cooked pretty evenly with the rest of the brisket compared to other cooks I've done. After removing the brisket from the cooker, it's getting wrapped in tallow-soaked butcher paper, wrapped in foil, and then held at 150 degrees Fahrenheit for 20 hours. Moving on to the second brisket, I cooked it in exactly the same way as the rotating brisket, The only difference is that it's sitting with the point to the firebox the entire time. This is the way that a lot of Texas pitmasters recommend to do it, including Aaron Franklin, so I've always just taken that at face value and cooked with the point towards the firebox for the entire cook. But I kept on getting really unevenly cooked briskets and inconsistent results, so that's why I was really excited to try this experiment. A lot of times, when I have the point towards the firebox the entire cook, it'll be overcooked, but the flat will be pretty much inedible because it's so tough. Now, the non-spinning brisket hit at least 190 internal everywhere in the brisket in about 10 hours. So a bit slower than the spinning brisket, which was the exact same weight, by the way, but the point cooked way faster than the rest of the brisket, and it hit 206 by the time the rest of the brisket had a chance to get to 190. I was really concerned about overcooking and ruining the brisket, so I opened the cooker lid just once in the cook to try to rectify the problem. Okay, I was gonna let this go the whole way without opening the smoker at all, but the point is at like 203 right now, and the flat is around like 170, and it's kind of making me cry, so I need to do something about it. So I'm gonna open up the smoker briefly, refill the water pan, and I'm gonna foil the point, but otherwise I'm gonna leave it facing the same direction with the point towards the fire. After the brisket hit at least 190 throughout, it got wrapped and held at 150 degrees Fahrenheit for 20 hours, just like the first one. Now it's time to slice into them and test them out. Okay, here we go. Let's see what we got in here. Let's get some gloves on so I can look like a real pitmaster. So let's take a look here. Just feeling around the flat, it does seem a little bit tough, like the flat got a little bit too much heat during the beginning part of the cook. Yeah, it does feel a little bit tough when I probe into it. It's not terrible, but it's just a little bit more tough than I'm used to. And that's probably because the flat was exposed to the hot end of the firebox for so long, because it was spinning constantly. Moving over to the point looks pretty good. It's probing like butter, as points usually do. But if we go down here into the flat area of the point, underneath, it's actually, I was expecting it to be tough, but it's actually quite tender. So it's just really this toe part, or this thin part of the flat, that is probing a little bit tougher than I'm usually used to. Okay, let's take a slice in the middle of the brisket here. I'm gonna move a little bit closer to the end of the flat because we trimmed so much of the flat off. I don't want to go into the point too much. Tell that's gonna be juicy, guys. Oh my God, get ready for it. Here you go. Ooh, baby. Eat me, Steve. Eat me. Yum, yum, yum. All right, let's get a slice of the flat here. And we'll get a slice of the point. I'll start over here. Got some fattiness here that I'll probably get rid of. Big chunker. And a couple burnt ends. Now I'm just going to continue doing slices of the point. All right, let's start with the point. Pull it apart, pulls apart easily. Give it a taste. Beautiful. Point's perfect, as they usually are. The big test is what the flat is going to taste like, so let's take a taste of the flat. So we'll pull it apart. Pulls apart pretty easily. Yeah, that's perfect. Ooh, that's tasty. That's a really good flat. This is actually a perfectly cooked flat. It pulls apart, but it still has a lot of moisture. It doesn't taste pot roasty. It's not overdone. It's not underdone. It's perfect. And I'll try a burnt end. It's a perfect brisket. Having said that, I want to take a look at the very tippy toe of the flat, because I have a sneaking suspicion that it's going to be quite dry. So I usually don't do this, but let's start slicing from the very end of the flat. And I'm going to make it really thin slices. So usually this part of the flat, like, I wouldn't even serve this to my friends or family. I would probably chop it up and save it for chili or something. It's just going to be dry. No matter what you do on your brisket, it's always going to be dry. So I don't worry about that too much, but getting into the sort of primo cuts of the flat here, that's when I start getting a little bit more concerned about what the tenderness and taste and texture is. So let's pull this apart. It's pulling apart a little bit tough, but it's okay. It's actually really good. And it actually pulls apart not too bad. So you know what? Despite the very tip of the flat probing a little tough and feeling a little bit tough, it's actually pretty well cooked, and I don't think that I could normally even do a flat much better than this anyway, so the spinny method seems to work pretty well. You want to hear something gross? Is that a good brisket sound or a bad one? I can just imagine some like old Texan guy just being like, "What the hell are you doing with that brisket, boy?" Okay, here's the second brisket. I'm going to open it up. Ooh, that's tender. Okay, here we go. This is the part that I'm worried about because I'm worried that the point got a little bit too much crispiness, but it seems a little tough on the very edge here. But otherwise, it's feeling pretty good. I can tell it's going to be nice and tender. Now, the flat, I'm not too sure about. It seems kind of just as tough as the other one, but I can tell when I try to pull some of the muscle fibers away that it's still coming apart a little bit, except for the very tip here. So that might have got a little bit too much heat. But otherwise, everything is looking pretty good. It's nice and soft. I'm just going to probe it a little bit here. It's about as tender in the flat as the first brisket I did. It's probing it at about 153 in the flat. Yeah, so it's pretty decent. It's not like probing like butter, but usually my flats don't unless they're like a Wagyu brisket or prime grade. Okay, in the middle of the brisket, it's a little bit more tender. The point has no resistance at all. And the sides are about the same consistency as the tip of the flat all around. So let's give this a slice. Right about there. Give you guys a look. It's pretty juicy. I'd say it's about as juicy as the other one. We'll get rid of that little string there. Yeah, that's juicy AF. Look at that. Get some tallow on there, prevent it from oxidizing. Do the same to the flat here. And I will take a slice of the flat. Right about, and actually I'll do the same thing as before. So I'm going to slice the very tips off of the flat right up to there. Again, I probably wouldn't even serve this. I'd probably just save it for chili or something like that. Let's take a slice of this. Okay, right about there. Get some big old burnt ends here. Oh man, this is so tender. This is going to be good. And I'll just do a couple slices of the flat, of the point, sorry. Oh, I'll have to do much bigger slices because this thing is almost falling apart. So I'll give you guys a close-up of the point. This thing got a lot of heat during the cook. I wouldn't say it's overcooked, but you can kind of tell that it's almost falling apart. It still holds it together on its own kind of weight, but if you pull it apart, there's almost no resistance. So let's try the flat first and see if it got dried out or if it's better than the first one that I did. Oh yeah, it's better than the first one. It's more juicy, it's more tender, it's not as dry. Let's see if I can pull it apart. It's a little bit tough to pull apart, but that's kind of how I like my flats. I take them up to 180, 190, so they're not quite tender. They're not tender at all, actually. And then I kind of cure that with the long hold period. So the 20-hour hold period in this case got the flat tender enough that people are going to enjoy it, but not overcooked or as tender as you might get if you went all the way up to probe tender and got these up to like 205 degrees. They would have just fallen apart. But I find the flat kind of has more of a pot roasty flavor when you do that. The fat is really well rendered on this, so happy with that. Beefy flavor, really flavorful seasoning, fat cap. So I'd have to say that I really enjoy this flat. A lot better than the last one. Now moving on to the point. This is the exciting part. It's good. Really good. It falls apart in my mouth. The collagen is perfectly rendered. You can see if I pull it apart, it's got a little bit of stretch, but barely any resistance. This is kind of the consistency that I tasted in Austin at really popular barbecue restaurants when I was there. It is really good. It's a little bit overcooked though. It's getting into the realm of pot roastiness, and it doesn't have the beefy flavor that the flat does. Because we finished the flat to only 190, it kind of retained its beefiness and its juiciness and flavor. And because we took this up so high to around 205, 206, 207, the point is a little bit pot roasty in my opinion. So, perfect flat. Little bit of an overcooked point. Now, I'll be honest with you guys, I already knew that rotating briskets results in more even cooking and better results, and I've been doing it for a long time. I just needed to do an empirical test, both to prove it for myself and for you guys, so you're not just taking whatever I say at face value. Now, obviously, I'm not expecting you guys to build one of these brisket spinny devices in your own smoker, although that's super nerdy and I think it would be cool, and I'd love to see pictures if you end up doing it. But here's something you can do without building something that elaborate. What I do is I put the point towards the fire for the first 4 hours of the cook. You'll notice that after 2 to 4 hours, the point really starts to break away in temperature from the rest of the brisket, as you can see in this graph. So I turn it with the flat facing the fire at the 4-hour mark, which just so happens to be around the same time the brisket starts stalling and putting out enough moisture to protect the flat from being directly facing the firebox. Then 2 hours later, at the 6-hour mark, I dump the moisture off the top of the brisket and I rotate it so its side is facing the firebox. Then at the 8-hour mark, 2 hours later, I rotate it so the other side is facing the firebox. And finally, at the 10-hour mark, I temp the brisket all over, and I kind of make a judgment call at this point. If the point is lagging behind, I put it towards the fire. If the flat is lagging behind and doesn't have good fat cap rendering, then I put it towards the fire. And I continue to rotate every 2 hours until the brisket hits at least 190 throughout, and then I do the long hold at 150 for 20 hours. Now, why 20 hours? Well, it's mainly because I finish my briskets at around 9 or 10 at night, and then I like to have them for dinner the next day. So that just so happens to be 20 hours. But if I am cooking them for lunch the next day, I might only hold them for anywhere from 10 to 15 or 16 hours. The only difference or adjustment I might make if I'm holding them for that shorter period of time is I might take them a little bit higher, maybe up to 195 throughout, because they need a little bit of an extra push to get tender with that shorter rest period. But enough of me talking. I'd love to hear from you guys about what you do to make your briskets cook more evenly. Do you spin your briskets throughout the cook? Do you cook them with the side facing the firebox, or do you use some other method? I'd really like to know. Let me know in the comments section below. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and if you haven't already, there is a new Facebook group called the Smoke Trails Barbecue Nerds that you can join, and you can also follow me on Instagram, and you can check out my Patreon page below for more community and direct access to me. Thanks for watching, guys. I will see you in the next video, and happy smoking.